Hi, everyone. This is Miriam Naime from Newcastle University and the Alan Turing Institute. Welcome to our SuperGen Smart Charging webinar series. The webinar is an activity of the Vehicle Grid Integration Group at the Alan Turing Institute, which is the National Institute in the UK for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence. On the webinar, we hosted speakers from across the domain of the EV world. We had speakers talk about communication protocols for electric vehicles, such as OCPP, ISO 15118, and more. We also had speakers talk about national and regional plans for the rollout of electric vehicle charging infrastructure. And also we had speakers talking about cybersecurity for electric vehicles. If you are interested in these topics, then we have all the previous webinar available on YouTube. One of the other outcomes of this webinar was two collaborations with some of the speakers on this webinar series. One of them was a review paper on communication protocols, and the other was a review paper on how to secure the electric vehicle charging infrastructure. Both these papers are openly available. Today, I am very happy to host Mattia Marinelli from DTU. Mattia is an associate professor with expertise in power systems, but also low carbon technologies, modeling and integration with the power systems. Mattia is involved in several R&D projects on e-mobility, storage, EV fast charging, and also, very interestingly, on an autonomous smart charging technology project. Mattia will share with us today some of the learnings from his projects, but also he will share with us his hands-on experience with living with electric vehicles, photovoltaics, and the demand response from these technologies. So without further ado, Mattia, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Miriam, for the kind introduction. Let me share my slides. Yes. Okay, so thanks, Miriam, and thanks, colleagues, for taking the time to join this presentation. So what I would like to share with you today is, let's say, some insights on the research project that I have, but mostly my perspective as a prosumer trying to adopt these energy technologies. As Miriam mentioned, I have a power system background. I'm an electrical engineer, and as I guess several of you, I do a lot of research to see how we can integrate more renewables, distributed energy resources, and EVs, and so forth. And I have to admit that something that, at least throughout the year, I've been missing, that we have all been missing sometime, it's, okay, how do users really react to all the ideas and the development that we are trying to force on them? The underlying message that we have is that we want to have more renewables. That's all clear. We want to live more sustainably. That's all clear. But does it come for free? I mean, what's the price that we have to pay for that? And what important is, what do the user have to accept in order to really fulfill this goals? So I've been trying to, live this kind of experience myself in the first place. And what I would like to do today is try to share some technical insights, of course, but also just some day-to-day feedback on basically trying to live sustainably. So I've divided my speech in a few parts. So the first one, just to put it in context, I would like to give you a picture of the energy needs and the CO2 footprint that I have in my house. The second one, focusing a bit more specifically on the photovoltaic system and net metering, how it works, why do we define self-sufficiency on consumption and so on. Then discussing a little bit about the flexibility of appliances. So how much can we get in terms of flexibility from, let's say, normal appliances that we have in the house, and then moving forward to flexibility from electric vehicles with insights on charging and degradation aspects. And then wrapping up, lesson learned, next steps, and of course, if you have any question. First of all, disclaimer. So even though I will be presenting CO2 numbers, I don't have the expectation or the ambition to have a full assessment of my carbon footprint, even though I think I'm covering a good chunk of it. The second one, I'm not here to lecture anyone on how to behave and what to do. I'm trying to share my experience, but in the end, since I'm a teacher, I can't really avoid that. But I have to say that try to run a sustainable life, it's definitely not an easy task. Now let's get a picture of my house, of my system. For completeness, I will be focusing, let's say, mostly on electricity domain and on the electric vehicle. But as I said, for completeness, I want to give the full picture because electricity is just one part of my energy need. So I have heating coming from district heating and wood pellet. And on an average year, so if it's not too cold or too warm, the winter, it's more or less 13 megawatt hour of energy demand. Electricity, it's much smaller. It's just a bit more than 2 megawatt hour. In the moment that I installed the photovoltaic plant, I got a 6 megawatt hour of production from the PV plant. Until the end of last year, I used to drive a Honda Civic, gasoline, standard gasoline car. The estimate that I have in terms of energy need is nearly 6 megawatt hour, which corresponds to 10,000 kilometers driven over here. And starting the end of next year, I replaced this car with an EV, so Nissan Leaf and E+. And the early assessment that I did is that if I need to fulfill the same 10,000 kilometers, I would need basically 2 megawatt hour of energy, including charging efficiency. Now I'll present a big table just to basically jump to the end. So tell you what are the results that I obtained. And then throughout the presentation, I'll go backwards and explain the different points that I used to achieve these objectives. So just to get a picture, before having any EV and any electric vehicle, that was my need in terms of heating, 13 megawatt hour. This one was the electricity, and this is the gasoline from the car. So all in all, 21 megawatt hour, equivalent with these emission factors to a little bit more than 3 tons of CO2 per year. Then I got the PV, but not yet the EV. And I said, okay, I think I'm going to achieve a 50% self-sufficiency. It means that I'm going to cover half of my electricity consumption with the local production. And the rest, of course, it's sold to the grid. So if I take in account the factors, the emission factors, considering that the PV energy, it's greener generally than the electricity production, even though in Denmark, the electricity that we have is already rather CO2 free because we have a bunch of wind and hydro from Norway, I can get down to a CO2 footprint that is 2.39 tons. And the last step is, okay, now I get also the EV. Also for the EV, my target is to achieve a 50% self-sufficiency, so covering half, so 1 megawatt hour with the local PV production. And the final objective that I intend to achieve is this 1.19 tons. So all in all, what I am achieving, or I'm through the way to achieving, is a reduction of the net energy need. So what I need to buy, basically, from 21 megawatt hour down to 11, and a carbon footprint that is 3 times smaller. And I have to mention, just for completeness, that even though the reduction is large, it's been even larger in the moment that I consider that when I bought a house, the thermal demand was twice as much. And then by doing some basic intervention and better energy management, I basically halved this need. And I just would like to mention that because, yes, PV is important. Yes, EVs can be useful. But in the end, basic energy saving intervention should always be prioritized. Right. So let's move forward. Now, this 50% self-sufficiency, this trying to self-consume as much as possible my production. First of all, let's define what do we mean that. So first of all, we need to have flexibility from appliances. That basically means that we need to try to adjust the appliance consumption pattern in order to match what the photovoltaic production is looking like on a daily basis. So how do we define flexibility? I think one fair definition in this context would be the possibility to postpone appliances operation without compromising too much, and I underline too much, users' expectations. I think we can agree on this kind of definition, which in simple terms basically means start the dishwasher when the sun is shining. That's it. So how did we get there? So how did I achieve this 50% in self-sufficiency? Let's look at the house electrical perspective. So I have a house, an independent house. So I have to mention, of course, that a lot of the things that I managed to achieve are also possible by the fact that I have my own independent house. I don't live in an apartment. I have my own parking spot, which of course helps quite a lot. I have a three-phase power supply. All the appliances in the house are just standard single-phase appliances. The photovoltaic inverter, it's a three-phase photovoltaic inverter, 6 kilowatt. And the electric vehicle, once I got that, I bought a three-phase controllable charger. Though I have to mention that being this one a Nissan Leaf, the Leaf will only charge on one phase. So it basically means that the charging range that I have for my vehicle, it's between 1.4 and 3.7 kilowatt on one phase. Then there is a smart meter from the utility, which is doing all the recording, logging of data and billing in the end. And then I had to install an additional smart meter, which is more used for control purposes. So to match, for instance, the consumption of DV in order to follow the photovoltaic production. Now, data. So which data can I get access to and then use basically in the assessment that I'm going to present in the next few slides? So all the data are average values over 5 minutes of photovoltaic production, consumption on the whole house, energy that is going to the grid, energy that is coming from the grid. Based on these four quantities, we can define then the two main metrics that we will use throughout the presentation, which are basically just the two sides of the same coin. The first one is the self-sufficiency, which is the ratio between consumption minus import related to the overall consumption. The complementary figure is called own consumption, which is the same consumption minus import, but referred to the photovoltaic production. So let's use the first one because it's been the first that I've been introducing. So the self-sufficiency is 50% that I want to achieve. So this is the picture that I got in 2020, where the EV was not there yet. I guess no one should be surprised. Denmark is rather north, so there is a decent amount of sun during the summer, spring, and so on, but winter, it's rather bleak in that sense. So the bars here are representing monthly values of consumption, and the yellow part, it's basically how much has been covered on a monthly basis by the local PV production. So we go from low values over the winter to fairly large values over the summer. I have to admit that this one was 2020, so last year. So that basically means that between March and May, that was completely locked down. So we were living in the house. And this is definitely helping a lot when you want to try to self-consume as much as possible during daytime. But I think that nowadays, with a good trend of working from home, partly at least, this can still help quite a lot. Now, let's get a little bit more in details and look at the hourly pattern of the photovoltaic production. So the box plot that you see here is displaying all hourly values over here. So for each hour of the day, you have 365 values, so one for each day. I guess no one should be surprised when we have the classic bell-shaped production pattern of the photovoltaic system. We have a lot of photovoltaic availability during daytime. And the key point, of course, as you can imagine, is just try to move the consumption in here. So let's quantify how much I can get. So to get this assessment, I try to understand, okay, how much did I use to consume before having the photovoltaic plant installed in my house on a regular basis. So I did this other box plot here, which is representing my consumption. So no EV, no PV throughout the year, seen again in terms of hours throughout the day. I guess no one should be surprised. Quite a good chunk of the consumption is concentrated in the late afternoon or evening of the hours. And then I did the same analysis once I got the PV plant installed. And you can see how the push was basically to move quite a good chunk of the consumption from the evening towards the midday. I then tried to quantify how much this translates in terms of self-consumption. And the result is that this one is a 50%, as we have been discussing since the beginning. And this one here, I estimated that if I had had a photovoltaic system at that time, this number would have been equal to 35%. So this basically is giving us already a first good number. So the push that the photovoltaic system, let's say, put on me, managed to get 15% of my consumption shifted throughout the day in order to match the photovoltaic production. Was it easy? To a certain extent, but let's say the user comfort, so to speak, was not completely, so I didn't have to give up to any kind of expectations. My wife will probably tell you otherwise, but now you are going to listen to my perspective. Now, let's see also the other complementary figure, because discussing about self-sufficiency is one point, discussing about own consumption can give also a little bit more a broader perspective. So if I look at the own consumption, which is the same numerator as before, but refer this time on the photovoltaic production, which is 3 times basically the amount of electrical consumption that I have, then you can clearly see the shape here. We have the photovoltaic production over here growing larger during summer. And we can see how in relative terms, the own consumption is larger during the winter due to low availability on photovoltaic system and gets smaller throughout the summer. Now, what I achieved until now without the EV has been 18%. The estimate for 2021, so by the end of this year, would end up 33%. Now, why is that important also to talk about own consumption? It's important to talk about own consumption because in the end, it's what is affecting the economic viability of the photovoltaic plant. So again, just to give you some numbers as an example. If I take 1 kilowatt of PV system, knowing that in Denmark under, let's say, good condition will yield 1 megawatt hour over a year, considering an installation cost of 1,500 euro, I can say that given the framework, the economic framework that we have in Denmark, which is any production will be paid with the market price, so with the spot price, which is a fairly low, 42 euro per megawatt hour means 4 cents per kilowatt hour. I can say that if I am in the, let's say, worst and almost impossible case that I'm not own consuming anything, then the payback time of my PV plant will be 36 years, which is, of course, quite a lot. The complementary figure is that if I manage instead to own consume everything that I produce, which is also impossible because I have nighttime consumption, then the figure will drop to 6 years. And this is due to the fact that the electricity that I pay as a private customer, it's rather expensive. So it's basically 6 times larger than the spot price. The question is, and that's the interesting aspect, where can you place yourself within this hyperbolic curve? So the initial situation that I had was the first X here, around 13%. What I managed to achieve was 18% by changing my habits. What I estimate with DV, which I'm about to reach, is getting down to 33%, which of course is changing quite a lot the economics of the PV system. I just would like to add one small note. I guess you have all been reading nowadays that electricity prices have been skyrocketing in Europe. So I just try to rerun this estimate by looking at the current spot prices that we have in Europe, which is basically twice as much in Denmark, sorry, which is basically twice as much what we had in the previous figure. And as you can imagine, this simply is changing the overall economics of the system. It's definitely making it more attractive. What is interesting, though, is that the difference in absolute terms between the different X gets smaller. So having a higher price for the electricity production is, let's say, pushing less myself, the user, to self-consume, because the values here are getting much closer. Now, one small, let's say, variation on the theme. I think it's important to quantify also how do we measure power and energy, because in the end, this is affecting the self-sufficiency or the own consumption value that we've been discussing. I think one important aspect to take in account is whether we have a three-phase system or a single-phase system. If you have a single-phase system, it doesn't really matter because everything, consumption and production, is just on the same phase, so there is no problem. If you have a three-phase system, such as mine, you have to remember that the consumption typically is on the individual phase by single-phase appliances, while photovoltaic production is evenly distributed on the three phases. So depending on the type of smart meter that you have, whether it's a per-phase smart meter or a summation smart meter, then things can change quite a lot. If you want to have just a simple representation, think about that you have three people in the house. Each of these person has its own income and its own expenses. One thing is that if you keep the accounting individually, where every individual is doing the sum between income and expenses. Another thing is if you put together all the income and if you put together all the expenses. So as you can imagine, from my point of view as a customer, it's more convenient to have a summation meter where I put together all the different phases. The other important aspect that we have to remember, particularly in the early days when there were the first photovoltaic installation, the netting period where I was allowed to basically cancel out production and consumption was generally over a year. Then it got down to a month, then to a day, then to an hour. And nowadays, the netting period is basically over 1 second. So it's an instantaneous netting. So I really need to consume second by second what the photovoltaic system gives me, because the grid is not acting as a storage for me any longer. And it's interesting to see how this 50% self-sufficiency would change, for instance, if I consider a summation, but with a netting over an hour, then it would get over 55%. So the 5% additional would be the storage equivalent effect of the grid, or how it would change if I consider a per phase meter, where I don't take in account the advantage that I have, that I can balance out the production and consumption of the different phases. And that would be down to 40%. Now, if we want to be completely honest, this 40% is what the grid is experiencing. Okay, so this 50% is just a favor that the regulator is doing to me by allowing me to balance out the production and consumption of the different phases. Now, moving forward, let's discuss a little bit further the consumption pattern. So first of all, in order to understand any kind of self-consumption, self-sufficiency perspective, you need to understand how one person is consuming. So you need to understand how the consumption pattern would look like. So in my case, I have a fairly small base consumption, which is running continuously. It's the router. I mean, all these data that I have at my disposal, they come with a price by the fact that I have always small computers basically switched on and communicating data to the internet. And this accounts for nearly 40% of the overall electricity consumption. Then it's important to understand how the, let's say, big appliances, dishwasher, washing machine, and so on, how they look like. So for these kind of appliances, you always have, in this case, a washing machine, a heating cycle in the beginning, and then basically not really a big consumption afterwards. It's just a machine spinning. While instead, for the dishwasher, instead, you may have 2 heating cycles at the beginning and then a drying cycle at the end. So in case you are short of photovoltaic production, you can play around with the fact that you can try to squeeze, for instance, a washing machine in order to make it happen when you have this, let's say, plateau of low consumption from the dishwasher. Another important aspect refers to the electrical stove. So I don't have a gas stove, as a lot of people have, so I have an electrical stove, which means that basically based on induction, which basically means that I can adjust the electrical consumption. And in this case, the, let's say, challenge, or so to speak, the compromise is between high consumption, but quicker, let's say, boiling time or cooking time, and the low consumption, and let's say, slower cooking time. Now, as you can imagine, if you are short of power because the sun, there's not that much sun, it's cloudy and so on, then the natural response would be, okay, keep it low, because then you can, even though it continues for longer, then you can self-cover with the photovoltaic production. There is just one small remark here, is that if you squeeze it too much and you keep it too low, then you are decreasing the cooking efficiency, so to speak. And I'm not talking about time, I'm just talking about the fact that the pot, for instance, will take longer to reach boiling temperature in case you are cooking a pasta and so on, because you will increase the thermal losses of your system. So this is an interesting compromise. I mean, on one hand, you want to keep the power low in order to consume as much as possible, also if the sun is not shining, but you are decreasing the overall efficiency of your system. So this is just a recap table on the domestic appliances. So where can we get the flexibility in the end? I mean, from the washing machine and the dishwasher, you can't really change how the machine is consuming. So you have to accept that. The only approach that you have is delaying the start, basically. And of course, deciding to do it during the daytime and not during the evening. And I mean, that's a fairly reasonable compromise. The one for the electrical stove, as we discussed, if you want to squeeze as much as possible photovoltaic production, you need to keep it low and for long rather than high and for short. For the electric oven, there is not that much that you can do. I mean, once the heating element is heating up, then that's simply it. As a side note, I think it would be useful in the future to have an electric oven where you have modular heating elements, so that once the oven is hot, you don't need to do a lot of switching on and off to keep basically the oven in temperature. Now, let's move to the second and to the second part of the presentation, where we focus on the, let's say, the biggest source of flexibility that we can have in this context, which is the electric vehicle. And I say the biggest because it's in the end the one that can really push forward quite a lot the flexibility that we can get in the house. If, of course, the EV is gonna be parked at home. So this is an important aspect. If you want to exploit the advantage of the photovoltaic system, you need to keep as much as possible the EV at home, at least during nice days. So first of all, how to handle the EV charging. So let's start again from the energy need. So what do we need? Let's say that I need to drive 10,000 kilometers, which would be more or less 2/3 of what a Danish average driver would do over here. This number boils down to a little bit less than 200 kilometers over a week, or a little bit less than 30 kilometers on average throughout the day. So seen in terms of energy and considering energy consumption of 5 kilometers per kilowatt hour, then we end up with 2,000 kilowatt hours over the year. Now, the key objectives that you have to keep in mind while managing the charge of EV are the following 5, basically. Avoid low charging power, more or less for the same reason of the electric stove, because low charging power will also imply low efficiency. Avoid high charging power for grid's sake. In this case, let's say from your point of view, you want to have high charging power in order to charge faster. But first of all, you will have a problem if you try to self-consume your photovoltaic production, which may not be that much. Secondly, you are gonna unnecessarily potentially overload the grid without really getting any real benefit. The third one, keep a, let's say, minimum amount of charge in the vehicle in order to fulfill few days of demand. And at the same time, avoid keeping the state of charge too high, and generally the lower the better for the sake of degradation. All this while the sun is possibly shining if you want to maximize the self-consumption. And it's not an easy task, but luckily smart chargers can help for that. So the first point about the onboard charger efficiency. So I've been doing some measurement on my car, and I've been observing that when I go to the minimum charging level that is allowed by the standard, which is 1.4 kilowatt, then the charger efficiency is a little bit below 80%. While instead, if I'm close to nominal values, it gets up to 90%. Now, is that good or is that bad? I think there is room for improvement in general for the overall efficiency process. But let's say, given the current technology, I think it's important to remember also this, let's say, small issue. So you may need to keep low charging level if you want to self-consume with low photovoltaic production, but at the same time, you have to be careful that that's going to cost a little bit in terms of losses. So now I'm going to show you two examples of, let's say, charging process with, let's say, the normal onboard, with the normal portable charger that everyone gets in the moment that you buy an electric vehicle, which is this standard cable here. Just, I'm sure you are aware, but just remember that this is not the charger itself. This is just a controller. Then the charger is always sitting on board of the car. So this cable here, it's a 1.8. So it allows a 1.8 kilowatt as a charging process. And here it's just a standard scheduled charging session for almost 10 hours. This one was, it's the heart of summer. I mean, it's the 18th of June. It was a nice sunny day. You get only few of these throughout the year. And this one was just a normal charging process. Here you can see on top, just a scheduled washing machine. And this is the amount of energy that you can charge over the session. Something similar, but better, you can achieve in the moment that you use a so-called smart charger. So something that can adjust the charging process based on spare production capacity from your PV plant. So in this case, you can see how the charging session is kept within the capability of the PV plant, and it tops up to 3.7 kilowatt. And that's the advantageous thing also. You can make sure that you can squeeze in appliances, like in this case, it's the same washing machine, washing again at 60 degrees, by, let's say, sacrificing, so to speak, the charging speed of your vehicle. Nonetheless, also in this case, you can achieve quite a decent amount of charge. I want to highlight these numbers also because in case you don't have a photovoltaic system, but you still intend to charge an EV at home, you can still achieve quite a good amount of charged energy, even though you don't really rely on high charging levels. I mean, the maximum value here is 3.7 kilowatt, and throughout 10 hours, I basically charge half of the car. This is just an example of how the charging session would look like in case you have clouds passing over throughout the day. Now, why reporting the charged energy? I think it's useful also to put it in perspective, because someone could say, okay, but you are tailoring the results based on your experience. So how do the results can be scaled or applied to other people? So as a part of our research projects, we have been doing some investigation on how people drive vehicles here in Denmark. So the curve here that you see on top is showing basically how many cars every day are driving, how many kilometers they are driving every day. And you can see that the largest majority is well within 100 kilometers every day. So if I just look at the two charging sessions that I presented before, if I charge 14 kilowatt hour, that basically means 87 kilometers, then this can cover 80% of the daily driving needs. And if I take the smart charging session with 3.7 kilowatt, then I can end up covering 95% of the daily driving needs. This is just a nice key takeaway, regardless if you manage to do that with solar energy or just with normal plug. I want to stress this also because this is also to, let's say, reassure people in the end, particularly if they want to transition from a conventional vehicle to an electric vehicle, that charging power does not need to be high in order to fulfill your daily needs at all. And also, this is an interesting perspective because if we look at the system point of view, then do we like to have a higher charging session? So as a part of also our investigations in other research projects, we've been trying to understand, based on behavior of population of 100 EVs, in case they all charge with a 3.7 kilowatt charger or with a 11 kilowatt charger, how it would look like the equivalent power that the grid would have to cope with. So the first number that we can get is that if we charge with 3.7 kilowatt, then approximately 42 people out of 100 will charge at the same time throughout the day. While instead, if we have 11 kilowatt, this number is basically half. But since the power is 3 times more, then we end up that the aggregated power that the grid experiences is 1.5 times larger. And then in the end, my point is, do we really need this 11 kilowatt? No, you don't really need that. Both because you will not really leverage the flexibility or the production pattern from your photovoltaic system, but also because in the end, you will unnecessarily overload the grid. And someone could say, why do you care? You care because in the end, if the grid operator has to reinforce the grid, you will simply transfer in the end the additional cost on the user themselves. So in the end, you will simply have to pay more. Now, moving to the next and also final, and probably for some also the most interesting aspect, so degradation. Now, here I'm talking about EV charging. So we are not really dealing with any overuse of the vehicle to provide any bidirectional service, but just by charging. What can we, let's say, how can we use our experience and our knowledge on degradation in order to drive the charging session? So without going too deep into degradation processes, which I'm not an expert myself, so I just rely on what people more experienced than me are telling me, is that we can divide degradation by basically 2 factors, cycling and calendar. So cycling at this point is not really relevant. What is relevant is mostly the calendar, because this is telling us what should it be the state of charge that we should leave the vehicle normally when it's parked at home. The general process, this is for a nickel manganese cobalt cell, is that the higher the temperature, the higher the degradation will be, and the higher the state of charge, the higher the degradation will be. However, this increase does not really happen linearly, but there are some plateaus in the end, which could be useful to take advantage to. Now, let's say there is an important aspect which has been, let's say, bothering me for quite a number of years now. And in order to define any degradation process, you need to clearly identify where you are starting from. So you need to clearly identify what is the nominal capacity of your storage. And I've been trying to look around, search and so on, and the definition of nominal capacity, it's something that doesn't exist, basically. I'll give you the example. So if I take again my my car, so my Leaf E+, I have 288 cells. Now I look at the data sheet, or at least to the data that I can find on the internet, and I know that a cell has a nominal voltage that is 3.65 and the nominal capacity that is 58.8 ampere hour. Now, I'm an electrical engineer. The operation that I can do without knowing too much about chemistry is I take the number of cells, I take the nominal voltage, I take the ampere hour, I multiply all together, and I get my nominal capacity in watt hour, which is 61.8 kilowatt hour. So for me, this would be my starting point. However, if I look at the standards, this standard 62660 from basically 2 years ago, so it's quite a recent one, there is no definition for nominal voltage. So this 3.65, it's not really a nominal voltage. And normally we have to keep in mind that the cell voltage for lithium-ion batteries, for lithium-ion cells, for all kind of electrochemical cell, spans between certain values. So in this case, it's between 4.2 and 2.8 volts. But that's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is that the definition of rated capacity, so this ampere hour that I read here, there is no universal way to define that. So each manufacturer defines it individually. And this is even more tricky due to the fact that the maximum and the minimum voltage that the cell can operate, it can change over time. So for instance, I can have that the cell can go from 4.2 to 3 volt as a fully charged or fully discharged. Or if I want to squeeze it even further, I can lower down to 2.6 volts. The final thing, which is actually also quite important, we are talking about capacity of a battery, which does not necessarily mean that it's just the sum of all individual cells, because not all cells may be perfectly identical. So in the end, defining the battery capacity, which is basically the starting point for any assessment of degradation, it's a tricky job. Just to give you a visual example. So if I take a battery, regardless if it's for an electric vehicle or just a stationary battery, and I have a certain usable energy that I can use, which is 95. And then I have an energy reserve equal to 5 that I cannot access at the beginning, but that the battery management system gives me the possibility to access over time. And over time, the battery will degrade. And after a certain number of years, I get a usable energy that is equal to 90. Now, I should ask myself, how much has the degradation been? Has it been 5%? Also, it's been 5 because I moved from 95 to 90. Or is it been 10 because I moved from 100 down to 90? And to me, this is something far from being clear. In the end, it can really change. I mean, you can see from a user perspective, so what the user will perceive is that the usable energy moved from 95 to 90. That's correct. However, when the user bought the car or the battery, what he paid for was 100 in the end. Now, just a few final remarks, because we have been trying to do, we have been trying ourselves to understand how the capacity of electric vehicles have been degrading over time. I haven't been discussing about V2G and so on, and I will definitely welcome any question about that in the end. But we have been doing some capacity measurements on vehicles that have been used on fleet vehicles. So that's not my private vehicle, okay? So on fleet vehicles that have been used to provide grid services, frequency control, you don't need to bother too much what frequency control is at this point, but have been used basically to be driven during the day, and during the night they were connected to the grid and they were charged and discharged in order to balance the grid. That's basically what they were doing. We have been measuring the capacity every 6 months over the last 3 years for these 10 cars. And you get the results in terms of state of health, so in terms of residual capacity. And you get numbers that look like this one. So there is a clear trend that the capacity is decreasing, and that's fair enough. There is a nice match between the measurement and the expected outcome that we get from the model that we have been building based on what we can find on the literature. But still, if I look at 6 months to 6 month period, sometimes the measurements are quite oscillatory or they are not so sharp. Now, that basically means I can trust the measurement to get a qualitative trend of the degradation. But if I have to trust on something that is 1–2% precision, then I start having a little bit of doubts, to be quite honest. Just one final slide, and then I'll wrap it up and open the room for questions. I'm trying to do the same on my own leaf, keeping in mind that now my leaf has less than 1 year, almost 1 year, basically. So I've been keeping a logbook, so a sort of diary, where I've been logging basically every single driving session that I had by using the leaf spy. So by basically reading the measurement from the onboard computer that is on the vehicle. And I've been keeping measurement, two measurement every day ever since the beginning. So I've been keeping track of what was the average state of charge over time, what was the battery and the air temperature over time, and what were the equivalent number of cycles considering the number of kilometers that were driven. And this is also a measurement that is coming from the battery, and I've intentionally obscured the values here because it's still an ongoing activity, which I don't, well, I would like not to expose myself too much. I've been experiencing this state of health trend. So I bought the car here at the end of November. I estimate that the battery was probably a couple of months older before the car was delivered at my place. This has been the degradation trend over the winter. You can recognize how it got larger over the summer due to the higher temperature. And then one day I've been experiencing this increase of capacity, which makes me wonder, why do I get this kind of jump? So does it make then sense that there is this energy reserve that gets released over time? And then coming back to my original question. So what should I account as degradation? So should I account the degradation basically the change from this point down to this point? Or should I account as degradation basically the change from this point down to this point plus the other degradation here? Now, with all these nice open questions, I would like to wrap up and let's say just get some takeaways. Technologies for CO2 reduction are there for sure. Data is precious. It comes with a cost, and it's also matter a lot how we measure power and energy, because then the figures can easily change. The PV plant is a harsh taskmaster, because in the end, if you want to try to match your personal behavior given to what the photovoltaic system is giving you, it's not an easy task. But personally, I mean, I see that also as a training, and also from a more philosophical insights, I think it's also nice, let's say, going back to the origin of humankind, where basically in the old days, our behavior was dictated by the seasonal and daily changes of the sun. Avoid high power consumption and avoid usage of multiple appliances at the same time, both for grid's sake, but also to maximize the self-consumption. However, be wary of low efficiency operating points. The behavioral flexibility from customer is there, but it's not that much unless you start to accept compromise in what is your basically life experience. User experience. The flexibility in EV charging is rather large, and definitely smart charging approaches should be encouraged. Next steps, of course, continue with the degradation assessment and also thermal and electrical characterization of my car. Probably a stationary battery, just for the fun of it, to try it out and also to make my wife happy. And possibly at a certain point also bidirectional charger for my Leaf, since I'm one of the few lucky guys that I can still survive with a CHAdeMO plug, which make it possible for me to use bidirectional approaches. You find references and further readings in the end, and references also for the CO2 emission factors. And I've been discussing too extensively about my research project, but if you have any curiosity, you can find the links here, and you're of course welcome to ask me anytime. Thanks for your attention, and of course, please, any question.
Thank you so much, Mattia, for this really interesting presentation. And I find it excellent how you started with saying it's so important that we focus on energy efficiency because there are so much gains to be done there first before we start thinking about the tech and all the new things. Out of curiosity, what have you changed in your house to gain this much efficiency?
Yes, so the basic intervention were, let's say, doubling the amount of rock wool on the roof, and that was extremely cheap. I had the space for doing that. Replacing a couple of windows that were still single glass, and then just installing some smart bulbs on the radiators and keep the temperature low, so avoiding unnecessary usage of heat in rooms that didn't really need the heat, particularly also bedrooms and so forth. And then in the end, I got down from this 26 down to 13 megawatt hour, which, as you are also stressing, it's been quite a good chunk of energy saving.
Got it, yeah. Thank you. I encourage participants to ask questions in the chat box, and I'll take them. Meanwhile, you had a slide showing the cloud cover, and I wondered, so did the charging stop when there was clouds, when you were charging using solar?
Yes. So there is I'll get here. Yeah. So the interesting aspect here is that I mean, I haven't been mentioning about the brand because I don't think it's that's really the point, but both the charger, so the smart charger, and the photovoltaic system are from the same company, Fronius. So the solution that I use is an integrated solution. That's quite advantageous because in the end, I can rely on the fact that the smart charger can get information on the second-by-second measurement coming from the smart meter. So the smart charger can see what's the photovoltaic production, can see what's the power flow going in or out from the house, and then you can basically set how much should the charging level be if you want like to completely self-consume what you have available or accept that you are going to consume some power from the grid. I'm in the process of assessing how quickly this can be done. And I mean, the numbers that I've been taking until now is that the whole process takes approximately 20 seconds, more or less. So it basically means that from when you read the power at the meter point of view to when the charging power of the EV is adjusted in order to cope with the change in photovoltaic production and so on, it takes 20 seconds. I think there is definitely room for, I mean, I think it's fairly fast, but I also think that there is room for making this one even faster. And just one final point, I mean, as a part of our research project, we are also investigating how this smart charger can be done autonomous so that the charging process can be adjusted based on embedded logics that does not really depend on what's going on the grid. And even more important, that depends on what other chargers sitting nearby are doing. So for instance, we have this interesting case of the parking lot where we can have multiple chargers that try to adjust their charging level in an autonomous way in order to provide an equivalent service to the rest of the system.
But maybe also taking into account other appliances in the house.
That's definitely the case. And this is, for instance, seen here. So this peak that you see here, that would be the washing machine, which is in terms of amplitude, this large. And if I didn't have this smart charger, then this consumption would have been just added on top of the basic consumption.
So how do you have things communicating to each other? I might have missed the point between what you do and what is autonomous. Do you have a home energy management system linking your PV and dishwasher and photovoltaic?
Yes. So the I can go back because it was at the beginning. Was here. Yeah. So the communication is a hybrid between a serial communication, so RS485, So there is a wired communication between the smart meter and let's call it home energy management, but it's not really a home energy management. I mean, there is the data logger sitting and the controller sitting inside the photovoltaic inverter. So the photovoltaic inverter in this case is basically acting as a sort of energy management, home energy management. So it's getting the information from the grid connection point of view with this dedicated smart meter. Then it's communicating the information through Wi-Fi to the Wi-Fi, to the router, to the house router, which makes me available through a dashboard over the internet or just through an app. And then it's also communicating Wi-Fi to the smart charger. And me as a user, I can communicate also via Wi-Fi to the smart charger as well. But in the end, the communication is basically a mix between a wire communication between this smart meter, which has no communication modules embedded, and the Wi-Fi between the different components.
And are you ready to have a third party controlling or managing your consumption, assuming, for example, your energy supplier or your DSO will pay you to have a grid? Is your setting ready for an outside management, like the link to the outside?
Yeah, so I think it's it's a question of what kind of service do you want to achieve? Because right now I'm more interested in maximizing my own consumption. So let's say, to be quite brute, I don't need anyone telling me how my vehicle should charge, because I just need to look at my photovoltaic production and adjust the charging level accordingly. But if I didn't have the photovoltaic system, and if I had let's say, other input coming from the system, which could be a time of use tariff, or it could be a price signal, then the system itself would be ready for that. And I think it would be fair to accept that, given a certain revenue.
Maybe I meant like the smart meter, is it ready to communicate? Like there is some sort of communication protocol for your smart meter or for your hams to be ready for outside?
This smart meter doesn't have any communication protocol except for the serial communication to the inverter. But the company makes available some API so that you can program, if you want to, your own algorithm, basically. So they give you the possibility if you want to play around with that.
Yeah, so there will be a bit work done, or maybe additional hardware required, assuming you wanted to allow a third party to manage your demand.
That's there would be the need, maybe not necessarily for additional hardware, but definitely additional software, yes.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to check the questions in the chat box. If you could do that as well, please.
Yes. Okay, so the first one is 14 hours parking is not continuous. What will be the flexibility if we consider 8 hours parking during the night? So I guess the question is more referring to the case of this case here. I guess the question was referring to this one. So I think here it's important to distinguish, let's say, a privately owned car from a fleet-owned car, because in this case, these cars that you see here, they belong to to a utility, so to the local utility in the municipality of Frederiksberg. So in that sense, they don't really belong to any private person. So they simply say, look, from this hour in the late afternoon when the working shift is over, the cars are going to be parked there and be available for providing grid services. And the advantage for the provider of these grid services is that it's rather predictable. Say, okay, I know that the cars are going to be parked there from this time to that time because it's aligned with the working hour, with the known working hours of the people. The situation, of course, is different if you apply the same approach to a privately owned vehicle, because then it means that you need to constrain the availability of your own vehicle. And here there is an interesting dilemma, so to speak, that on one end, the grid operator, whenever they are procuring these services, they need to have a sort of reliability. So they need to know, okay, from this hour to this hour, we know that there is going to be this car providing this amount of service. That's it. In the moment that you start introducing uncertainty from privately owned vehicles, that maybe they get unplugged and people need to drive it for whatever reason, then, you know, where do you put the boundary? I mean, then you start having a little bit of a constraint in that sense. Just as a final note, I think I didn't mention that extensively here, but V2G services, in my mind, make much more sense, where by V2G we mean bidirectional control of the vehicle, so charging and discharging. Make probably much more sense for, let's say, fleet of commercial vehicle rather than private households, unless these private households are like remote areas and so forth. But then again, we enter in a big box of possibilities, because one thing is talking about V2G and bidirectional control. The other thing is to say, what do you use the bidirectional control for? So what do you use it for? Providing frequency control? Do you use it to provide load shifting, or what? Because then things can easily change in one way or the other. I hope I covered the question. If not, please let me know. Okay, so now I read the next question. Thank you for the presentation. Battery degradation could be issue constraint of an objective in managed charging and V2G. What could be a reasonable max rate of degradation to accept? How does this affect the size of EV pool that can participate to smart charging? Right. So how much degradation and so forth. Okay, so also in this case, let's divide the system in two things. So we have two types of degradation, cycling and calendar. Now, let's consider what we do. We can either do, let's say, smart charging, so just controlling the charging approach of our vehicle, or we can use the vehicle not just for smart charging, but also to do bidirectional charging. In the first case, with any smart charging, we have the advantage to intentionally keep the charging level of the vehicle lower than what it could be if we didn't have the smart charging approach. And actually, in the paper that I'm referring here, you can find some consideration about how much this translates in terms of money. Now, if you start doing a bidirectional control on top of the calendar, then you are adding also cycling degradation. And then the question is, okay, how much can you accept? Also, again, if you look at this paper, we end up that even though you do quite intense frequency control and use a lot of cycles, in the end, the amount of degradation that you experience with cycling, it's still relatively small compared to the degradation that you would have in the battery anyway. So the underlying conclusion was that, I mean, if you have the battery, it may be convenient to actually use it for more things rather than just using for driving. Keeping in mind, however, that if you commit to provide a certain service, then you can't use the vehicle to be driven. So from a degradation point of view, I would not be too much concerned in that sense.
Mattia, there is another question on degradation.
Yes, please.
And we'll take it. And there's also an interesting one on phases, but we'll take it just after the degradation topic. How can you have a breakdown of the impact on the degradation from driving and the impact from charging? How are you going to be able to tell which is coming from what? Yes,
that's a fair point. I mean, you would not be able to do it with just measurement. I mean, then you would need to rely on models. I don't think I have it in the backup slides, but in this paper that we are referring here, we have been trying to split how the degradation, that basically means how the state of health would look like, or which component of the state of health decrease would be due to each source of degradation. So to cycling due to driving, cycling due to frequency control, and calendar aging. And then you try to make, of course, an assessment based on models. Then, of course, the estimate that you get will be as good as the models are in the end. But let's say, not from a measurement point of view, but at least from a modeling point of view, you can get this kind of information if you are interested in.
And my understanding was that you are not worried, as other studies maybe have insinuated, the degradation from frequency control.
Let's say, if you look at, since we are on this slide, if you look at the numbers here, you see, okay, I have a state of health that went from 100 down to a little bit more than 80 in 5 years. And then someone could say, wow, that's a lot. It is a lot. I'm not saying that. However, you have to keep in mind two things. The first one, the battery that you have here, it's a fairly old technology. It's a lithium manganese oxide, which nowadays has been a little bit, let's say, phased out because it was cheaper, but it tend to degrade a little bit faster. That was the first point. The second point is that the size of these particular batteries that are here, it's a 24 kilowatt hour of battery. And in this case, the service was provided with a band of 9 kilowatt. Now, if you think about the ratio power over energy, it's rather high. Then, of course, if you get a larger battery and you just keep the same ratio, so larger power that you commit for the service, then things are not really going to change. But if you consider larger batteries, but you keep the same power bit, then the equivalent cycles that the battery will experience will be less. So in the end, degradation will be lower. So again, in the end, it depends also a little bit, as I mentioned, on what type of service you are gonna perform, and what in the end is the additional percentage of degradation that you are gonna, let's say, accept.
How did you manage to get access to state of health data? It's usually known to be commercially sensitive, and make it hard. The OEMs make it hard to get it out from loggers.
Yes, let's say there are two type of information that we have been getting out. So the first one, the information that you see here in this slide are based on our own measurement of state of health. So what we have been doing is that we've been taking these cars, driving them, discharging them completely, and then charging them in a controlled manner, so that then we could measure how much energy was charged into a battery. And then we say, okay, the amount of energy that we can charge refer to the initial capacity, it's giving us the state of health. So that's our empirical method that we describe in this paper. Otherwise, the other source of information, which is the one that we are displaying here in this plot, it's based on the LeafSpy. Now, for those of you, and I guess many of you will not know what the LeafSpy is, the LeafSpy is an app that has been developed independently, so it's not recognized by Nissan, and it's supposedly reading information that are provided by the CAN bus in Nissan vehicles, so in the Leaf, as you can imagine, but also in the NV200 that I showed before. And then we basically get this information out. Now, we have a little bit of a mystery here, because we are not completely sure how the LeafSpy is treating this information, whether it's simply reading this information or whether the information gets somehow interpreted. And by interpreted, it means that they get translated. So we're not entirely sure that we can completely trust this measurement. But at the same time, it's the only, let's say, onboard information that we can get based on the, let's say, onboard computer.
Okay, thank you. And the other question in the chat box on the battery degradation is from Christian. And I'm assuming Christian is wondering if there are issues with batteries and OEMs are deciding to quantify what is the state of health, then how can we ensure that when people are buying this car?
Yeah, yes, it's definitely a fair point Christian is raising. And I think we can boil it down to this example here. So, as I was mentioning before, in this standard, and I'm definitely not blaming the standard for that, okay? But in this standard, I cannot read, and if anyone thinks that I'm wrong, I would be very welcome to get a message, but I cannot read a clear way to define the capacity of a cell, nor the capacity of a battery. I mean, if you allow me just a small variation, if you take a photovoltaic cell, a module, there is a standardized procedure. I mean, you take a cell, you flash it with 1000 watt over square meter, you keep it at 25 degrees, and then you define that's the nominal power of the cell. Then the cell will never work at 25 degrees and at 1000 watt per square meter. But at least you have a standardized way to define the power rating of a cell. Easy peasy. I don't get the same for a cell, electrochemical cell, not a solar cell, okay? So there is nothing that is telling me in a clear and standardized way, you should do this and you should do that in order to define the capacity of a battery. And until we clear this out, then basically we are in this problem here. So we have this energy reserve, this energy buffer, call it whatever you like, which is kind of messing up a little bit what is the real capacity of the battery, and that basically means also what is the real degradation of the battery. And until then, it's basically arbitrary, the number that we get. I hope that covered the question, Christian.
Meanwhile, Mario asked, if you have a 3-phase solar inverter and 1-phase charger, is production of the other 2 phases going normally to the grid during EV charging? And if that's the case, how can this be optimized?
Yes, so that's a very relevant point. So we are basically discussing about, let me just get, where was here? Yeah. So we are basically discussing this situation here, where I have the photovoltaic production evenly balanced on the 3 phases and consumption that is just on 1 phase and changing around. And as I mentioned, right now, the grid is kind of doing me a favor by letting me balance the power consumption on the phases. So in terms of accounting, it's not a technical favor, it's an accounting favor that they are giving me. Now, the question is, nice, but can we do some ways so that we can balance these things out? And I mean, the approach is that, in my mind, what we could try to pursue is to avoid 3-phase system at a domestic level. I mean, now here in Denmark, it's 3-phase systems are fairly diffused, particularly in independent houses such as mine. But I mean, I think that what we should achieve, what we should aim at is lowering in general a power need from the grid so that we can end up having consumption, production, EV consumption just boil down on the same phase so that the balancing can be done in an easy manner in the end. Still, if you need power capacity and you still need to rely on a 3-phase system, then I don't see any other option rather than having some basically an inverter here that is just rectifying the 3 phases and then inverting them again into new 3 phases, and then you have a DC bus which is acting as a bus in between. But I mean, that's not going to be a cheap solution.
You mean the phase balancer, the actual power electronics phase balancer to balance the phases automatically is not a solution? This is what you meant, right?
Yeah,
do you have a lot
that's not an easy one.
Do you have a lot of issues in Denmark where people have three-phase connections and it is unbalanced because they use more power on one phase out of the others?
Now that brings back nice memories of a few years back when one of the first research projects we were doing about EV integration, we were actually investigating this issue, so that there were problems with phase being unbalanced. There was a nice, not nice, but an interesting case in one small city south of Roskilde, where I'm currently staying, where in a neighborhood, they installed three-phase heat pump, but the three-phase heat pump had the compressor, let's say, just on one phase. And the electrician has been installing systematically all the heat pumps exactly in the same way, so that over the neighborhood, all the heat pumps were connected exactly on the same phase. Now, as you can imagine, this ended up being a huge problem because that phase was heavily loaded. So the solution then was simply to go there, unwire, and start to rotate the different phases. Nonetheless, also in this case, the grid, for whatever reason, was still rather largely unbalanced, and we were measuring the power of the transformer where it was like 50% on one phase and more or less 25-25 on the other two phases. I think that for the time being here in Denmark, we have been living on the fact that most of the distribution grids were recently upgraded when they were taking down overhead lines and putting down into cables and so on. So they were fairly oversized. But at a certain point, I mean, this could easily come back as a problem. So yes, we have been experiencing three-phase issues, but I don't think they are still on the, let's say, top priority. They are still not that much of a problem yet, at least.
Thank you. And is it still, and what is the main problem for the grid in Denmark? Is it the peak demand?
I would say, I mean, I would say that problems in the electricity system in Denmark are, well, okay, let's divide them on two levels. So the first one, it's on an overall system level. I mean, Denmark has been massively investing in interconnection in the past few years. I mean, I think the interconnection capacity, I don't remember the number exactly, but I think it's larger than the peak consumption, or more or less on the same level. And that basically made it possible to integrate a lot of wind in the beginning. But as you can imagine, that can't really continue forever in the moment that the others get a lot of wind. So now, at least on a system level, there is a lot of interest in getting new approaches, power to X, the energy islands that have been mentioned in the news and so forth. But all in all, I don't think there is any big issue in terms of system level. I mean, yes, inertia has been going down. There are problems of reactive power compensation in some point, but I think they are well handled by the TSO. And I think Denmark is experiencing one of the highest continuity of supply rates in the whole Europe. On the low voltage system instead, I would not say instead, but on the low voltage system, I think all in all, in general, there have been a lot of upgrades recently when they were, as I mentioned, digging the cables into the ground. And this made it possible to kind of postpone some of the perspective problems. But on the other end, the overall age of the distribution grid is also getting larger and larger. So a lot of transformers start to be quite old. I have been reading that in some particular feeders, particularly when summer houses are located, they started to experience these issues, which are basically low voltage levels at the customer side, or sometimes some fuses blowing in the substation. I don't see that as a widespread problem yet, but it's something that definitely a lot of people are aware, particularly in the moment that EVs, for instance, will really catch up with the installation or heat pump as well. I mean, I haven't been discussing heat pumps because there is no room in my house for heat pumps because there are already too many actors heating up. And that was just to wrap up this point. my personal takeaway on the fact that we don't really need high power consumption, definitely not from a heat pump, but also from electric vehicle to fulfill our needs. So I think that should be well kept in mind while sizing grids, but also while trying to discourage, so to speak, also peak consumption in the houses. Just one final remark that I think is quite interesting. I mean, I come from Italy, and in Italy, the grid operator, when you buy furniture, so electricity supply, you buy basically maximum power that you can consume, which can be 3 kilowatt, 4.5 kilowatt, 6 kilowatt, or until you are one phase, or 10 kilowatt and you go 3 phase. Here, the minimum power level that you buy as an independent house, it's basically 17 kilowatts, so it's 25 ampere 3 phase, which is huge if you think about that. In my mind, there should be also some, let's say, part of the tariff should be related also to the power that you are buying for the supply.
Thank you, Mattia. This is really interesting, and thanks for the insights on the different grids, Danish and Italian. I'm worried about the time. Do you have one last question?
I'm free until 3, so that's
excellent. Thank you. Okay, so talking a bit about behavioral flexibility, you mentioned that that was your perspective, and your wife wasn't happy with some of the changing in consumption habits. Can you give me your wife's point of view?
Okay, so my wife, thanks God, it's let's say it's playing the devil's advocate, so to speak. So, I mean, if it was for me, I'm let's say a user, but I'm a technically educated user, and I'm also a little bit of an extremist sometimes. And I always have the risk that basically any assessment I can do, I say, okay, if I can do it, then everyone can do it. But I have to be careful because everyone does not really have the same kind of insight or push that I have. So she's wisely playing the fact that, I mean, if she wants to cook something at this point in the evening, I should not start bothering and saying, I mean, we have just 100 watt of photovoltaic production, so no, you can't switch on the electrical stove. And this is actually, I mean, in the end, that's what a lot of people rightfully, to a certain extent, would like to experience. I have to say that this 15% that I was mentioning in the beginning, yeah, so this one here, so moving from this consumption in the evening to the consumption during the midday, I mean, quite often ended up, let's say, with some fights, so to speak. And I think that, I mean, if I take, let's say, a normal, let's say, let's call it normal, standard user, getting this 15% of shift, I mean, it does not really come without any compromise. So I got this 15% of shift, but I mean, sometimes we were really saying, okay, no, you can't cook a lasagna tonight. I mean, let's make it on a Sunday during lunchtime, because on Sunday there's going to be nice weather, and then we can allow ourselves for that. Not in the evening, for sure, and not today, because today is cloudy. Then the question is, where do you put the bar? I'll leave it up to the individual, this answer. I think you're muted, Miriam. Okay, I think Miriam has some problem on muting, but I can just go through the questions.
On?
Yes. Okay, presentation, I can send it to Miriam, and I think she's gonna upload that in the website. And I think the same for the video. So if you have the interest, and I mean, the presentation, I know that you have been presenting a lot of numbers, so that was sometimes a little bit overwhelming. But then you can just check the number again. on your own. I think I probably cover every question that there was in the chat. Yeah, so, well, if you have any other question, please write it down. If not,
Mattia, I'm really sorry about this. Zoom has
no problem. I
just couldn't take back control. Anyway, thank you so much for the last question. Just to confirm, you can hear me now, right?
Yes, correct.
And I can hear you. Okay. I'm not sure how come this happened. This is the first time that the Zoom crashes like this. Anyway, I would like to thank you so much for your time. As you can notice, we took over 30 minutes for Q&A, so we had a lot of interest in the prosumer side. Any concluding remarks?
Yes, I think, I mean, I want to be positive. So I think there is a lot of, I mean, we can make it. Let's say if we look at, you know, the objective in reducing temperature increase and dependency on energy, CO2, and so on. I think we can make it in the long run. But I also think that it will not come for free. So I think that to a certain extent, we will have to accept a reduction or a constraint in the way that we use the energy and power also.
Yeah.
But let's take it on a positive note.
No, agreed. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. And thanks everyone for participating.
Thank you. Bye.